The man sleeping in his '66 Chevy truck bed had 17 cents in his pocket and a wife who'd just walked out. Bellflower, California, 1970. John Force was 21 years old, working construction when he could find it, and the truck, primer gray, rusted quarter panels, wasn't even running most days. He'd push it to get it started. At night, parked behind some strip mall or under a freeway overpass, he'd lie there listening to street racers heading toward Lyons or Irwindale, headers echoing off concrete, and he'd think about the funny car he'd seen at Lyons the month before. The body had lifted 6 feet off the chassis during a burnout, firelight from the headers painting everything orange, and when it launched, Force felt it in his sternum. That night, in the truck bed, he made a decision that defied every rational calculation. He was going to drive one of those things. He had no money, no sponsors, no connections, no mechanical training, and, this part's important, no visible path from where he was to where he wanted to be. What he had was a willingness to absorb punishment that would break most people. Over the next 25 years, he'd crash 17 funny cars into walls, catch fire 11 times, break bones in configurations doctors said shouldn't be survivable, go bankrupt twice, and become the most successful funny car driver in NHRA history. But first, he had to figure out how to eat. Force grew up in Bellflower, a working-class sprawl southeast of Los Angeles where hot rodding wasn't a hobby. It was the primary economy. His father drove a truck. His mother worked retail. The family lived in a small house on a street where every third garage had an engine hanging from a cherry picker. Force wasn't mechanically inclined, which in that neighborhood made you an outsider. He couldn't build an engine, couldn't weld, couldn't read a blueprint. What he could do, and this became the foundation of everything, was sell. He'd sell anything, door-to-door vacuums when he was 16, insurance policies he didn't understand at 19, himself constantly, to anyone who'd listen. After high school, he bounced, drove trucks, poured concrete, framed houses, got married to his high school girlfriend, had a baby, got divorced when the money disappeared. The truck became his address. He'd shower at construction sites or public beaches, eat 1 meal a day at Denny's, budget the rest for gas and tool booth tolls to the drag strips where he'd hang around the pits talking to anybody who'd tolerate him. This is where most versions of the story skip ahead to his first ride. But that jump erases 5 years of groundwork that explains how Force operates. Between 1970 and 1975, he didn't just hang around drag strips, he embedded himself in the funny car community through pure, relentless presence. He'd show up at Lyons on Wednesdays when teams were testing. He'd work for free, pushing cars, cleaning parts, fetching tools, holding fenders during body repairs. He learned the ecosystem. Funny cars in the early 70s were transitional machines, caught between the short wheelbase gas coupes of the 60s and the long nitro-breathing, rail-bodied missiles they'd become by 1980. Teams were small, usually 3 or 4 guys working out of cramped shops in Pomona or Anaheim. The cars cost maybe $15,000 to build if you did the labor yourself, but maintaining one through a season ran $50,000, and match race appearance fees, the primary income source, topped out around $800 per event. The math didn't work unless you won consistently, and winning required both driving skill and mechanical innovation the rules would immediately ban. Force understood none of the mechanical piece, but he understood the financial pressure. These guys needed help, and help was free. He got his first ride in 1975 from a car owner named Jack Krisman, who needed a backup driver for a match race in Fremont. The car was a Vega-bodied funny car running a 426 Hemi on 90% nitromethane, enough fuel concentration to make the engine try to eat itself every run. Force had never driven anything with more than 300 horsepower. This was 2,000, minimum, delivered to the rear tires through a clutch that engaged like a controlled bomb. Chrisman gave him 15 minutes of instruction. Keep your foot in it until you see the finish line or something breaks, whichever comes first. Force qualified dead last, ran a 7.89 at 181 miles per hour, lost first round, and crashed into the guardrail, exiting the shutdown area because he forgot to deploy the parachute. Chrisman fired him immediately, then called back 2 days later because his primary driver had quit. Force ran the rest of the season, crashed twice more, never won a round, and decided this was exactly what he wanted to do forever. Between 1976 and 1982, Force drove for 7 different teams, got fired from 6, and established a reputation as the guy who'd drive anything for almost nothing. He'd show up to match races in cars that hadn't been tested, cars with experimental clutches, cars other drivers rejected as too dangerous, and he'd make full pulls on tracks where the shutdown area was a dirt field. During this period, he crashed 11 times, caught fire 4 times, broke his left leg, fractured 3 ribs, and compiled a win-loss record of 41-89. He was terrible, not just inexperienced, actually bad at driving. He'd red light at the starting line, over-rev the engine off the line, pedal the throttle mid-track when he should have kept his foot planted. Other drivers started calling him brute force, a reference to his driving style, which involved hammering the throttle and hoping the car survived. But teams kept hiring him because he'd race anywhere, anytime, for whatever money they could scrape together. And somewhere in those 6 years of losing, he started figuring out the clutch. The clutch in a nitro funny car is where races are won or lost. It's not a simple engagement mechanism. It's a multi-disc system that controls how 8,000 horsepower transfers to 2 rear tires across 1,000 feet of asphalt. Get it wrong and you either smoke the tires into oblivion or bog the engine and watch your opponent disappear. In the late 70s, clutch tuning was still voodoo. Teams adjusted preload, changed disc counts, swapped friction materials, and basically guessed based on track temperature and humidity. Force couldn't tune a clutch. That required mechanical knowledge he didn't have. But he learned to feel it. He could tell crew chiefs exactly what the car was doing at launch, when the hit was too soft, when the discs were grabbing inconsistently, when the lockup point was wrong. This feedback loop, force describing sensations, mechanics translating into adjustments, became his value proposition. By 1982, he was still losing most races, but the cars he drove were becoming more consistent. Owners noticed. In 1984, Force did something nobody in funny car racing had attempted. He started his own team with 0 funding. Not low funding, 0. He borrowed $60,000 from a friend who owned a transmission shop, bought a used Corvette-bodied car from driver Raymond Beadle, set up a shop in a rented industrial space in Yorba Linda, and convinced his second wife, Leslie, they'd gotten married in 1981, to quit her nursing job and manage the operation. The financial model made no sense. NHRA, funny car racing by mid-80s, required a full-time crew, a semi-truck for transport, $3,000 in parts after every race, and travel expenses that topped $10,000 per month. Match race fees had collapsed as NHRA's national event schedule expanded, so the only real money came from winning, and Force's record suggested that wasn't happening. He entered 16 races in 1984, qualified for 12, won 0 rounds, and ended the season $140,000 in debt. Creditors started calling. Parts suppliers cut him off. The transmission shop friend wanted his money back. Leslie was pregnant with their second daughter. Force should have quit. Instead, he called every potential sponsor he could find in the yellow pages. This is the part where the Force mythology gets built. Between 1985 and 1987, he made approximately 3,500 cold calls to companies asking for sponsorship money. He pitched auto parts stores, tool manufacturers, oil companies, tire distributors, beer brands, insurance companies, fast food chains, and once, this actually happened, a company that made industrial lubricants for factory machinery. His pitch was simple. I'm John Force. I drive a funny car. I crash a lot, but I'm getting better. And if you give me money, I'll put your logo on the side and talk about you in every interview. Nobody bit for 18 months. Then, in late 1986, a regional manager for Wendy's hamburgers agreed to sponsor 3 races for $15,000 total. Force put their logo on both side panels and the hood, ran 3 consecutive first-round losses, and turned each post-race interview into a Wendy's commercial. He'd stand there, covered in soot and Nomex fibers, and tell the camera, "We lost today, but you know what never loses? A Wendy's single with cheese. Fresh, never frozen, just like our racing program." It was absurd. It worked. Wendy's re-upped for the full 1987 season. With steady funding, Force could finally address the fundamental problem. He still couldn't drive consistently. His qualifying efforts were erratic, sometimes in the top 8, often outside the show entirely. His reaction times at the starting line averaged 0.087 seconds, which in funny car racing might as well be a full second. He'd win one round on a fluke, then go out immediately. The breakthrough came when he hired Austin Coyle as crew chief in 1985. Coyle was a self-taught engineer from Riverside who'd worked for several top teams and had a reputation for unconventional solutions. He looked at Force's operation and told him the car wasn't the problem. The driver was lazy. Force was treating staging like a binary. Car in the beams, foot on the throttle, wait for green. Coyle made him practice staging for 3 hours a day, drilling the precise rollout distance, the exact preload on the trans brake, the muscle memory of launch without thinking. They built a practice tree in the shop, and Force would sit in the car, engine off, and stage 200 times per session. The repetition was mind-numbing, but it worked. By mid-1987, his reaction times dropped to 0.050 average. He started winning rounds. Then he started winning races. Force's first NHRA national event win came at Montreal in 1987. He qualified 9th, beat Tom Hoover in round 1 on a hole shot, took out Mark Oswald in round 2 when Oswald smoked the tires, and faced Kenny Bernstein in the final. Bernstein was the 1985 and 1986 funny car champion, had factory backing from Budweiser, and ran a state-of-the-art operation out of a 15,000 square foot shop in Michigan. Force was still working out of his rented industrial bay with a crew of 4 part-timers. At the starting line, Force staged shallow, barely breaking the second beam, which gave him a slight rollout advantage. When the tree dropped, he left first, 0.041 to Bernstein's 0.063. The cars ran nearly identical elapsed times, Force's 5.43 to Bernstein's 5.41, but Force's starting line advantage held through the finish. He won by 8 feet. In the post-race interview, he cried. Not emotional dampness, actual sobbing. He'd been racing for 12 years, lost hundreds of rounds, gone broke twice, crashed 17 cars, and finally proved he could compete against the best teams in the sport. Leslie was in the stands with their daughters, and Force kept pointing at them while trying to explain what the win meant. The NHRA interviewer eventually just let him talk until he composed himself. The segment ran unedited on ESPN that night and became one of the most watched drag racing clips of the decade. The Montreal win unlocked something, but not what Force expected. He didn't suddenly become dominant. In fact, he only won one more race in 1987 and finished the season 7th in points. What changed was the sponsorship landscape. Companies started calling him instead of the reverse. They didn't care about his win-loss record, they cared about the exposure. Force had figured out how to turn every appearance, every interview, every pit moment into content. He talked to fans for hours, sign anything put in front of him, pose for pictures with anyone who asked, and whenever a camera appeared, he'd become a one-man marketing department. After his second win at Sonoma in 1988, a reporter asked about his driving style, and Force launched into a 5-minute monologue about throttle response, clutch management, tire shake, and how his sponsors, he named all 6, had made the car possible. The segment was supposed to run 90 seconds, but ESPN aired the whole thing because it was genuinely entertaining. Castrol saw it and called the next week about a potential deal. By 1990, Force had transformed his operation from a shoestring garage team into something resembling a modern race shop. But the structure was chaotic. He had a crew chief, Coyle, 3 full-time mechanics, a truck driver, a parts manager, and Leslie running the business side. But Force himself functioned as driver, public relations, sponsor liaison, hiring manager, and occasionally janitor. He'd finish a race on Sunday, drive the hauler overnight to California, spend Monday and Tuesday at the shop working on the car, Wednesday making sponsor appearances, Thursday traveling to the next race. He slept maybe 4 hours per night. The schedule should have broken him, but Force operated on something beyond normal human energy regulation. People who worked for him describe a kind of manic intensity. He'd be in the middle of a mechanical conversation, suddenly pivot to a sponsorship call, then shift to driving technique discussion without pause. Austin Coyle once said, Force's brain was like a radio stuck between stations, pulling in multiple signals simultaneously. The first championship came in 1990. Force won 4 races, qualified in the top 5 at 13 of 20 events, and clinched the title at the season finale in Pomona. He beat Jim White in the final round with a 5.31 at 274 miles per hour. At the time, the second quickest funny car pass ever recorded. What made the championship remarkable wasn't the speed, it was the consistency. Force didn't have the fastest car or the biggest budget. Bernstein's Budweiser team had both. But Force qualified well at every race, rarely red-lighted, and survived rounds by making fewer mistakes than opponents. Coyle had developed a clutch tuning program that prioritized reliability over peak performance, which meant Force's car almost never smoked the tires or broke parts. In a season where mechanical failures eliminated half the field, Force kept advancing. The title felt inevitable and impossible simultaneously. Inevitable because he'd outrun or outlasted everyone. Impossible because 4 years earlier, he'd been qualifying on the bubble and losing first round. Winning the championship didn't satisfy Force. It confirmed he'd been correct to keep trying, when quitting made more sense. In 1991, he won 6 races and defended his title. In 1993, he won 10 races, a single-season record that still stands, and won his 3rd championship. The run from 1990 to 2002 was unprecedented. Force won 10 NHRA, or Funny Car Championships, in 13 years. He became the first driver to win 4 straight titles, 1990 to 1994. Then broke his own record with 5 straight, 1996 to 2002. During this stretch, he won 81 national events, qualified number 1 at 47 races, and set elapsed time and speed records in every funny car class configuration. The dominance wasn't just statistical, it was psychological. Other teams started building their programs around beating Force specifically. Crew chiefs would design clutch systems to counter his starting line advantage. Drivers would study his staging technique, his shutdown procedure, his interview style. He'd become the benchmark, which created a weird dynamic where Force was simultaneously the most successful and most targeted driver in the sport. The success created fractures Force hadn't anticipated. By 1996, his operation had expanded to 2 cars. He drove one, driver Tony Pedregan drove the second. The shop had moved to a 40,000 square foot facility in Yorba Linda with a full-time staff of 22. Corporate sponsorships from Castrol GTX provided a multi-million-dollar annual budget. But running a large team meant Force had less direct control over his car, which drove him insane. He'd second-guess Coyle's tuning decisions, argue about clutch settings, demand changes between rounds that contradicted data. Coyle, who'd been with Force since 1985, finally quit in 2001, exhausted from the constant conflict. Force hired Bernie Federley as replacement, fired him 8 months later, then brought in a rotation of crew chiefs who'd last anywhere from 6 months to 2 years before the intensity became unbearable. The pattern revealed Force's core contradiction. He'd built a sophisticated operation that required delegation, but his personality demanded total control. He wanted elite professionals making optimal decisions, but he also wanted to override those decisions on instinct. By the mid-2000s, Force was in his 50s, had 16 championships, 124 career wins, and nothing left to prove. Conventional wisdom said, retire at the top, transition to team ownership. Let younger drivers carry the program. Force hired younger drivers, his own daughters. Courtney Force made her funny car debut in 2012. Brittany Force started racing Top Fuel in 2013. Ashley Force Hood had been racing since 2007. John Force Racing became a family operation with Force as driver, owner, and patriarch. The arrangement created uncomfortable dynamics. Force would criticize his daughter's driving in post-race interviews, then defend them against outside criticism with ferocious intensity. Rival teams complained the family structure gave Force Racing an unfair advantage, shared data, combined testing, coordinated strategy, but NHRA rules allowed multi-car teams, and Force had simply built the largest one. In September 2007, at a race in Dallas, Force experienced the crash that should have killed him. During a semifinal round against Kenny Bernstein, his engine exploded at 300 miles per hour, sending shrapnel through the carbon fiber body. The car veered left, hit the retaining wall, disintegrated. The body separated from the chassis. The engine block was ejected. Force remained strapped in the chassis tube frame as it tumbled 400 feet down the track, shedding components. When it stopped, track safety crews found him conscious but unable to speak, blood coming from his helmet. The medical report listed fractured sternum, broken left ankle, shattered left wrist, severe burns on both hands, facial lacerations, and traumatic brain injury. Doctors said he'd never drive again. He was back in the car 5 months later. The comeback was ugly. Force's reaction times were slower, his hand-eye coordination compromised. He struggled to stage consistently, which had never been a problem. Mid-season 2008, he crashed again, this time in Seattle, when the car veered into the left lane wall at 280 miles per hour. He broke ribs. 2 races later in Chicago, he smoked the tires off the line and had to be helped from the car, disoriented. People close to the team said the brain injury from Dallas had caused permanent damage, but Force refused neurological testing beyond the minimum NHRA required. He kept racing. In 2010, at age 61, he won his 16th championship, becoming the oldest funny car champion in history. The season included 5 wins and 12 final round appearances. His reaction times had recovered to .050 average. Either the brain had healed or Force had adapted to the deficits through muscle memory and pattern recognition. nobody could definitively say which. As of 2020, Force was still driving at age 71. He'd announced retirement multiple times, then shown up at the next race. His operation had contracted slightly, down from 4 cars to 3, but John Force Racing remained the largest team in NHRA. His career statistics were absurd: 16 championships, 154 national event wins, 243 final round appearances, and over 1,000 round wins. But the numbers don't capture what made Force so historically significant. He didn't revolutionize funny car technology. That was guys like Coyle, Dale Armstrong, and Bernie Federley. He wasn't the quickest or fastest. Those records went to guys like Robert Hight and Ron Capps. What Force did was transform drag racing from a niche motorsport into a viable entertainment product. His willingness to make himself available to fans, media, sponsors, created a template for driver marketing that every professional racer now follows. Before Force, drag racers gave 3-sentence interviews and disappeared into the hauler. After Force, engagement became mandatory. The persistence is what defines him. Force was homeless at 21, sleeping in a truck, eating 1 meal daily, with no mechanical skills and no obvious pathway to success. The rational move was quit. Get a stable job, accept limits. Instead, he embedded himself in the funny car community, drove terrible cars for no money, crashed repeatedly, went bankrupt twice, and kept showing up until competence became consistency, became dominance. By the time his daughters started racing, Force had been in the sport for 40 years. He'd outlasted every rival, survived every crash, rebuilt after every bankruptcy, and accumulated championships through a combination of skill, durability, and refusal to acknowledge stopping as an option. The 16 titles aren't flukes. They're the inevitable result of staying in the fight longer than everyone else could stand.